All right, my favorite second block biology class, minus one or two of you. I think you all know who I'm talking about. Hope you guys all had a great weekend. It is Monday morning when you are watching this. You are with Mrs. Huss. At this point, you guys were supposed to do two things. Thing number one was to correct your photosynthesis quizzes. You should have made corrections in color, and you'll ultimately put your first grade on that, and then I'll put correction points in there as well. If you were gone, you should have went out in the hall. Make sure you go get those kids now. Otherwise, we're just going to do a quick, short little bit of notes here. Before you guys start this, Mrs. Huss will do an ACT passage with you about photosynthesis. I think. I haven't quite decided. And then we just need to kickstart our new chapter. And then when I come back tomorrow, we'll really let the dust settle and get through this one pretty quick. You guys remember we just got done with photosynthesis. So we talked about the circle of life. The other part of that is called cellular respiration. So you guys all should have these packets. I went out of my way last night to make them in color for you. You're welcome, all of you, even Levi. But I really wanted you guys to see, and as complicated as this looks, just like last time, it is a very specific process in our bodies, but for our class, we're going to keep it general and just understand in our mitochondria, how is it that we as humans and animals and corgis and babies, how is it that we make our energy? As we speak, Olivia and I were just talking about how we're worried about Simi's energy for her tubes that she had to get this morning. She wasn't allowed to eat after midnight. So, again, just big picture, this applies to all of us. It's a very, very complicated picture, but we're going to make it really easy. All right. So, if you guys all flip to that first page of notes, I got to make sure I can get to mine here. I made a little PowerPoint. And Mrs. Huss, if you would, I'd love for you to stop this as it goes so they can kind of take their notes. Otherwise, guys, if you go to your first page of notes, you should all see this picture to start. And we should know, if it were me, I'd relabel this the circle of life. But what we talked about was the top half of this page. Now what we need to talk about is the bottom half of this page. So we talked about how during photosynthesis, sunlight right here comes in into chloroplast, and it helps take CO2 that we breathe out and water we give to our plants. And in that chloroplast, it ends up making two things. Number one is glucose, the sugars that we eat in those plants, and the oxygen that we breathe on planet Earth. Now what we'll be talking about, and the reason why this chapter is pretty easy compared to the first one, is that it's the exact opposite thing. So what you guys see down here is this is where we as human beings in our cells and all living organisms breathe in oxygen, and then we eat glucose, and what we do is we make ATP, which is the energy that drives our bodies, and we end up breathing out carbon dioxide, and we know 70% of our body's water. So that really, when we look at what cellular respiration is, Mrs. Huss, feel free to pause it, but this is when heterotrophs, not autotrophs, so us as heterotrophs, we breathe in and there's that oxygen, and then glucose is the sugars that we eat. We breathe those things in, and what we do is we make ATP and energy in our cells. And as a result, as we go through that process of respiration, which is breathing, we also breathe out carbon dioxide and we make that water in our bodies. So, with that being said, I kind of wrote a reminder. If you want to scribble something about it, you can. But don't forget, this diagram is called the circle of life. It's the start of our second quarter of class, and one of them leads to the other. Photosynthesis leads to respiration. And then when respiration happens, it leads back into photosynthesis, and it is the ongoing cycle of all, you'll see I put bio, all life on planet Earth. So with that being said, everyone, let's move down the page a little bit. And again, we're just doing this page is all, and then you guys will kind of do your own little dive, okay? With that being said, very similar to photosynthesis, guys. We talked about the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. Cellular respiration can be divided into two parts. So that first part, everybody, that G word is glycolysis. It's actually pronounced glycolysis, but glycolysis helps us see what it is. And what it really is glyco and lysis. And glyco has to do with glycogen, and we know the word lysis means to burst or to split. So glycolysis is when we eat glycogen and store it in our foods, and when it's time for us to go use that, we split it and take that big sugar we've packed in and break it up so that it can go into our mitochondria and give us energy. So we'll add this note in a second, but glycolysis always happens first. Glycolysis always happens first, and that's really, really important for us to understand. The second part then, and really it's not necessarily the second part as much as it's just the process, is called aerobic respiration. Okay, now the word respiration is breathing, and we know that all living organisms do that in some way, shape, or form. Okay, if you remember, guys, there's two types of respiration and two types of most activities. There's aerobic, which means with oxygen, and you can see the word air, oxygen, air. So if I go for a nice walk and I'm breathing in and breathing out, we call that aerobic exercise. You guys probably have heard of like some water aerobics classes. That's where they're moving slow enough where they're not getting out of breath. When my track girls start to do really, really hard workouts where they breathing hard, that's called anaerobic. And an means none, and aerobic means oxygen. So anaerobic is when we don't have oxygen in certain activities. We know when a lion goes and chases after a gazelle, he can't sprint forever because that's an anaerobic activity and his oxygen can't keep up. All right? So keep those two words in mind. The glycolysis, guys, happens, and when we say cytosol, we kind of think about the cytoplasm. The reason why, and you'll see this on a slide in a couple pages, but glycogen's pretty big, and our mitochondria are pretty small. So we have to break the glycogen in half before it goes into our mitochondria. So that glycogen, the food we have, is just out in our cytoplasm and our cytosol. So in order to split it, that's where that happens, is outside. Aerobic respiration, on the other hand, is where we actually make energy, and you guys know from our last chapter, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So when we get to really how does this all happen, the glycogen will be broken up and then go into the mitochondria where we can use it to make energy. Like I put here, I added this, but glycolysis always happens first. And you guys will see what I mean by that in just a second here, okay? So Mrs. Huss, feel free to pause it if they need to catch up, but make sure we're listening, rewind it if we need to. Everybody, if you go down the page here, these really are the two cycles of how this works. So over here, this is if we have enough oxygen. Over here on this side on the right is what happens in our body if we don't have enough oxygen. And what I mean by that is not an elderly old man with his oxygen tank. What I mean over here is if we are doing really hard exercise where we run out of it, or you'll notice down here, this is also how we make some of our food and some of our alcohol in our real world. You'll notice that both of them, though, either one, whichever way we start with, what always happens first is the glycolysis. And what we have to do, everybody, is we have to start with the food we eat, that we ate for breakfast, and we have to break it down. And that happens in glycolysis or glycolysis. That always happens first. You'll notice it takes that glucose and it breaks it down into a special molecule called pyruvic acid. You'll also notice over here on this side, there's ATP here and ATP here. This side makes a lot of energy. That's why I can go for a nice 5-hour walk, because I'm making enough energy to keep up with it. Whereas when I go out and sprint, I only make a little bit of energy, so I can't sprint forever. I know a lot of you believe I have superhuman-like effects when it comes to physically beating kids like Levi Tovin or Jackson Van. Put your phone away, Levi. You should be listening. Beating those kids in a race, okay? So you'll notice then what happens next. They're all the same up until this part. Then you'll notice the word aerobic and the word anaerobic. And what happens next depends on if we have oxygen or not, okay? So if we do have oxygen, we go over here and we start breathing out and making our energy. If we go over here, we don't have enough air to keep up and enough oxygen, so we have to go through other ways, and that's really what we'll learn about the next couple days, guys. So that's a really, really nice start. This was a nice short 9-minute video. Mrs. Hustle explained you guys are just going to do 1 or 2 more things in your packet here to kind of kickstart this and have a nice slow Monday, and then when I come back tomorrow, we'll lecture over it. We do a couple different ideas for lab here. We'll do a little balloon lab later this week. But with that being said, guys, get those notes, use these notes to kind of start that activity. You'll finish with that little idea / project, and then I'll be back tomorrow. But please be on your best behavior for Mrs. Huss. If she has any questions, she can text me. But Simmy's tube should be done by the time you guys see this, and hopefully I'll see you first thing tomorrow then, as long as everything goes okay. Behave, hold each other accountable, and make sure Brandon and Levi and Jackson don't work at the same table in the back. See you guys tomorrow. Bye.